Radio, streaming live on www.facebook.com/DZRJ810am or on YouTube, channel RJAM News. To all Teleradio Bandido viewers and listeners, you can now watch Teleradio Bandido on our new YouTube channel, RJAM News. Hit the subscribe button and like the video. Don't forget to click the bell icon so you get notified when a new video gets uploaded. Don't miss out on our dynamite lineup.
Mga kababayan,
magsama-sama na tayo. Joy Belmonte, handang tumulong. Tulong-tulong, tuluyan-tulong. Joy Belmonte, ng Quezon City. Tuloy ang serbisyo, tuloy ang progreso. Si Joy Belmonte ng Quezon City. Joy Belmonte, handang tumulong. Tulong-tulong, tuluyan-tulong. Joy Belmonte ng Quezon City.
Magandang hapon po sa inyo lahat. At again, welcome to our program Kontra Birada. Dito po sa Radyo Bandido at napapanood din po sa RJTV. Ako po si Atty. Mike Toledo at syempre kasama po natin ang isa sa pinakamagaling na abogado dito sa ating parte ng mundo. Walang iba kundi si Atty. Karen Jimeno. Magandang hapon, partner. Good afternoon.
Hi, good afternoon, partner. And good afternoon din sa mga nakikinig sa atin today. And we have a very relevant episode today because we're going to talk about the Ukraine-Russia conflict. And we all know that this has not only affected Ukraine and Russia, but also other countries as well, including the Philippines. So, but to understand that further, Attorney Mike, we invited someone in order to shed light on the issues and to analyze this better.
That's true, partner. And I would like to thank you so much for inviting our dear guest for today, who I also know and respect. And of course, I've been reading his works in the past and I've heard about him, of course, many times. And it is good indeed that despite his busy schedule, he is here with us this afternoon to share his views on what's happening in the Ukraine. So, wag na po natin patagalin at let's all welcome po ang ating panauhin sa hapon na ito. Walang iba kundi si Father Ranhilio Aquino, the Dean of the San Beda Graduate School. Magandang hapon po, Dean.
Good afternoon, Attorney Mike. Good afternoon, my dear Karen. I hope that you will still teach with us in the second semester, Karen.
Of course.
Your busy schedule.
Yes, of
Mike,
course.
thank you. Mike, thank you so much for inviting me for this program.
My pleasure, Dean. When it was also mentioned by Atty. Karen, who I understand is one of your professors in the graduate school, I said
Yes.
that is an excellent choice to have no less than Father Ranhilio Aquino, who I've met you before, Father Dean, and at the same time, I've read some of your works, and some of them were published also in the newspapers. And I have to admit, you're one of the legal minds that Karen and I really respect.
Yeah,
Thank
one
you
of
so
the
much.
most brilliant legal minds in the Philippines, and I would say worldwide.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Father Rani speaks, I think, at least 4 languages, not including the local dialect. But also, with respect to this topic, Dean Aquino also hosted and organized a forum on this Ukraine-Russia conflict last Tuesday. So I think it will benefit the wider audience na hindi lang mga academics, but because of the reach of Radio Bandido and RJTV in terms of the TV, the radio, YouTube, and Facebook, a lot of people can understand more. Ano ba talaga yung what is this conflict about, and what are the repercussions at the international level, but also for the Philippines. So, Father Rani, maybe you want to start us off by giving us maybe just a background of how this whole thing started.
Well, a little bit of history. There was once upon a time a huge state known as the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR. When Boris Yeltsin became president, however, the USSR collapsed and the constituent states became independent republics. One of them is the Ukraine, and others are Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, others. Boris Yeltsin, Vladimir Putin has always considered the demise of the USSR one of the greatest global catastrophes. He considers it a huge misfortune that this thing happened. So, from that mindset alone, Attorney Mike and Attorney Karen, you can understand that there is a longing in Vladimir Putin for the hegemony that USSR once enjoyed. Yung bang malaki ang sakop ng USSR na wala na ngayon kasi natapos na yung USSR, nagkahiwa-hiwalay lahat ng parte niya, naging independent republic sila. Pero, huwag nating kalimutin din na the USSR was itself an artificial unity composed of states that were once independent and that were just forced into this union by sheer force of arms. Nakikita natin yan na nangyari sa China in relation to Tibet, in relation to Mongolia. So, yung mga makapangyarihang bansa na yan, sinasakop nila yung maliliit na maging parte sa kanila. Now, ang talagang nag-udyok kay Putin dito sa gera na ito, na kanyang inumpisahan, dapat maliwanag yan sa lahat ng tao, kanyang inumpisahan, ay yung takot na niya na yung Ukraine would become a member of NATO. And he was so afraid that NATO membership would mean that NATO powers could park their nuclear or long-range weapons in Ukraine, which is next door to Russia. And wanting to avoid that, he launched this war.
So clearly, Father Rani, yung talagang si President Putin, no, at the outset, talagang ang isa sa mga programa niya to make sure na ang kanyang mga sakop, no, the people that govern in Russia would really not be divided but will be united in supporting him, is to stoke the flames of nationalism and to stoke the flames na ibalik ulit ang glory ng Russia na nawala dun sa pag-disintegrate ng Soviet Union after the Cold War. Kasi tama ba sabihin na, Father Rani, na in a way, would you agree that it is similar to what happened to Adolf Hitler in World War I, in Germany in World War I, when the Germans were defeated and the Versailles Treaty was entered into, and we all know how difficult the provisions of the treaty was as far as the German people is concerned. Parang napahiya din sila doon, kaya nagkaroon ng Adolf Hitler, nagkaroon ng World War II. Would you say there's a similarity?
Yes, the similarities are very clear, no? Putin wants to get back the glory, as you said, of the USSR, and I think more importantly, he does not like the West encroaching anywhere near his boundaries. So kanyang malaking takot na pag naging NATO member ang Ukraine at maging kaibigan ng Germany at lahat ng kaalyado sa NATO, parang may isang dagger that is aimed at the heart of Russia, since Ukraine is just next door to Russia. But, you know, on the one hand, I've always insisted on this, the fear or the conjecture, yung bang hinala mo na maging member ito ng NATO, is never a legal justification for waging a war of aggression. In fact, aggression under the Rome Statute is an international crime. And I have read somewhere that processes have started in the International Criminal Court against Vladimir Putin.
And would you think that would have any ability to stop the aggression of Russia towards Ukraine?
You know, Karen, given the determination of Vladimir Putin, who has in his veins the very same blood that ran through the people who ran the Soviet Union for such a long time, it will be a long shot to stop Vladimir Putin in his tracks until he is able to dictate the terms of the end game. And you see, just now I read the news that there is a huge convoy making its way for Kiev, the capital of the Ukraine, and that will only exacerbate things. On the other hand, this morning there was this news that a delegation had arrived in Belarus so that there could be negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. But Karen, for me, the fact that the international community stands as one in its condemnation of Putin is a very strong statement, and that makes Putin think twice. He cannot say that the right is on his side, and no matter how mighty economically Russia is, it certainly will feel the pinch of all the sanctions that have been leveled against Russia.
The sanctions are what normally is called like the external actions of other states, but in terms of the available proceedings at the international field, what do you think would be the most effective way for any country to stop Russia?
You know, the big problem, I put that in my column that will appear tomorrow. The big problem of any country that wants to militarily intervene is it has to have a legal pretext to do so. At the moment, Ukraine is not a NATO member. So Article 5 of the NATO treaty cannot be triggered. Under that article, if any member state is invaded, all other states run to its rescue. They cannot use that because Ukraine is not yet a member of NATO. So notice what has happened so far. What Germany did was to send military hardware to Ukraine and leave the Ukrainians to use the hardware themselves, because obviously they cannot put boots on the ground. You know, Atty. Mike, I also think that if you count on the U.S., that's useless. The U.S. is wary, it is tired, it is fatigued, it is suffering from war fatigue. And in this conflict, Biden just appears to be as confused as he has always been. No?
I'm glad you mentioned that, Father Rani, the Biden being confused, because I think, and correct me if I'm wrong sa impression na ito, I think karamihan ng mga policy wonks, policy experts, foreign affairs experts, international law experts, leaders for that matter, those analyzing what was happening prior to the actual invasion of Russia into Ukraine, they were saying that I think their thinking at that time, ang paniniwala nila ay ito si Putin, nagpo-posturing lang yan. Hindi niya gagawin yan kasi baka posturing lang yan, parang he just wants to position himself, maybe ask for some concessions, but to actually launch an invasion, malamang hindi niya gagawin yun because sa kanilang pananaw, wala naman talagang very big strategic advantage. And then hindi klaro kung ano yung endgame Because can you imagine, well, are they willing to occupy in the same way that they occupied Afghanistan? And we know what happened in Afghanistan. So sinasabi nila, hindi naman siguro niya gagawin yun. Kaya, correct me if I'm wrong, Father, para bang maraming na blindsided, parang they have misjudged him. So some say, maybe yun nga, no? He has become very emotional. And kagaya ng sinabi niyo po, nung sa umpisa pa lang, na sinasabi niyo na siguro nga, ang sa kanyang isip, hindi, we have to bring back the glory days of Russia. Bring back the same status quo as the Cold War when Russia plays an important and pivotal role in international relations. So, in other words, Father, nawala yung image na dati sa mga Ruso at sa mga buong mundo of being a pragmatic leader, calm, determined, and the ability to navigate his country through treacherous waters, no, treacherous shoals. Ano po ang yung pananaw? Dean?
You know, I listened to the debates in the House of Commons of the United Kingdom, and well, that was one very beautiful show of unity between the government and the opposition, because nagkaisa sila sa pagkondena sa ginagawa ni Putin, no? They even referred to him as lawless. They referred to Russia as a rogue state. They were asking guarantees from the Prime Minister that should he set foot in the United Kingdom, he would be arrested. But you know, Karen, as late as the forum that San Beda Graduate School of Law organized, this question was asked: do you think Putin will really try to take Kiev? And at the time, the consensus was, no, he will not do that. So Atty. Mike is correct. At the time, we all thought he was merely posturing. Now, it's becoming clearer to me that he will prosecute the war until he can send Zelensky to the negotiating table. And you know, even if itong dapat maliwanag sa lahat, no, kahit na mapipilit niya si Zelensky na umupo sa negotiating table, yun pa rin ay sa akin pananaw paglabag. Kasi ang ginawa mo, nang himasok ka sa hindi mo teritoryo at nang mapilit mo lang ang isang presidente ng isang bansa na makipag-usap sa iyo at magbigay ng mga konsesyon sa iyo, yun ay talagang mali sa akin.
Yeah, I agree with that point of view, Dean. And I guess like for me, just from knowing what exists or what remedies there are, the practical question would always be, is there anyone that could enforce against Russia for their violations? And I guess, but for me, I'll go a step back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of Putin's type of leadership. I've always thought that, as Atty. Mike said, that he was more pragmatic, and you know, with even Russia just coming out of a pandemic, I'm surprised that, you know, the cost of waging war to him outweighed or did not outweigh, the decision to attack Ukraine. So do you think that he's just being, emotional in this sense, or is there really something strategic behind what he's doing economically as well?
Going back to a point that Mike raised a while ago, which is a very interesting point and something that you suggested, Karen, no? If he is supposed to be a pragmatic leader, which he was all of these past years, why suddenly this apparently reckless move? One can think that probably there is some internal instability in Russia involving his leadership, and he wants to show Russia that they still have a strong president who is willing to rid Russia of all threats. Now, kung ang tanong, sino ba ang makakapigil kay Putin? Ang problema, walang gustong sumabak sa gera. Parang pagod na ang mundo sa gera. Katatapos ng Afghanistan, katatapos ng Iraq, ito na naman. So, parang pagod na lahat. But you know, sanctions have their way of working. Kaya lang, Attorney Mike and Attorney Karen, you and I know very well that sanctions bite both ways.
Yes.
Habang pinaparusahan mo yung sinasanction mo, ikaw mismo na nang paparusa, may parusa din sa'yo. For example, I was reading now, why is Macron taking a rather laid-back attitude? Of course, rhetorically, he will say that everybody has to protest against the illegality of Putin's move. But Macron realizes that Russia is one of the biggest markets of France, and he's not about to imperil that. And let's not forget that one of the reasons in this conflict is gas. Russia supplies a lot of gas to Europe, and the United States is very wary about that because habang ang Russia ay rinarasyonan niya ang Europa ng gas, nagiging makapangyarihan ang Russia because next time, for example, na hindi mapagbigyan ng kagustuhan, Russia can easily say, isasara namin yung gas pipeline na papunta sa inyo. So that's one of the things there.
Aba kayo, Dean Rani, no? Talagang, and that's a good point that my partner, Tony Karen, raised the matter of sanctions. No? Because usually talaga in situations like this, we've seen it, they've done it with Iran, with Iraq, and other countries, gagawa sila ng sanction, and somehow, I guess the jury, well, in all probability, it will take a while. No? Hindi naman biglaan yung epekto ng sanction. It will really take a while before its effects are felt on the ground. But we are certain, of course, na talagang sanctions can actually be very difficult to the country na may sanction na ginagawa. Pero tama rin po kayo na it cuts both ways. Tatamaan din po yung ibang bansa kasi globalized na po tayo. Kaya nga, napansin natin, di ba, Din Rani, na while they did sanction, I think mga nagsasanction sila with respect to their banking, pati na rin yung sa SWIFT, tatanggalin na sila dun sa SWIFT, restriction on the transfer of certain technology, freezing of assets, especially of aside from Putin himself, but the other oligarchs and
members of the elite family, which
yes,
I want to ask Dean later, like how they even identify those families. But yeah,
yung mga elite, kagaya ni sabi ni Atty. Karen, mga elite families, no? Pero despite that, they were still very careful. Sinabi nila na, pero when it comes to oil, kasi Russia is one of the major suppliers of oil and gas, hindi daw kasama yon. Hindi daw kasama sa sanctions yon. In other words, sinasabi nila, tatanggapin pa natin yung oil and gas ng Russia.
Yeah. Yeah, so I was thinking, was that a calculated risk on Putin's part that, okay, I'm going to wage this war because I know that the world cannot afford to cut back on the oil that we're supplying. So, you know, it's not really a big economic loss to them. Is he that smart? I don't know.
Kaya nga for me, Karen, it's a combination. It has to be a combination of strategic moves, diplomatic moves, political moves, economic moves. You cannot use one measure alone. For example, because of the stalemate in the Security Council, the General Assembly of the United Nations was compelled to use a very rarely used clause, uniting for peace, that allows the General Assembly to pass resolutions that usually have greater punch. I have just posted that international law professors usually teach their students that General Assembly resolutions are not legally binding. And I'm saying that that's a misstatement. The more accurate thing is to say that General Assembly resolutions do not have the same effect as resolutions of the Security Council. But don't forget, the General Assembly is where all member states have one vote and where they sit. In other words, when the General Assembly passes a near unanimous resolution, you have the consensus of all the states of the world. And it can even be enunciative of customary international law. Kaya hindi dapat maliitin yung ginagawa ng General Assembly ngayon. By the way, Attorney Mike and Attorney Karen, no, I was very proud of the Philippine statement at the General Assembly, where we made very clear that we were joining our voices to the voices condemning the invasion of Ukraine. It was a very short statement because I think their time at the podium was limited, but it to me made me very proud to be a Filipino.
Yeah, but Father Rani, in terms of if the General Assembly is able to basically state the position of the nations, what comes next? Like for people who, like just ordinary people who are listening to this, I guess the bottom line will be, okay, then what can the other nations do to help Ukraine, which is very lopsided, like the power between the two countries that are involved here. So what can the General Assembly and the rest of the countries do to stop this ongoing crisis?
Unang-una, Karen, yan din ang tanong nung tayo diskusyon sa China, no? When we went before the International Arbitral Body for a resolution of the West Philippine Sea dispute. Anong mapapala natin dyan? Anong makukuha natin dyan? And the first answer is, alam natin kung sinong tama at sinong mali. At malaking bagay na yon. In other conflicts in the past kasi, owing to the conflicting claims, it was very hard to say, sino bang tama, sinong mali. But when you have an international body like the United Nations, particularly its General Assembly, on the assumption that the resolution will be adopted almost unanimously condemning the Ukraine, and I see that happening very soon, then it will be clear to the world, mali si Putin, mali si Russia. So kung mali sila, tulungan yung talagang naaapi. Kung anuman ang may tulong natin sa kanila. For example, this morning, I saw an advertisement of UNICEF asking for assistance that can be extended to the children of Ukraine. That alone is some kind of help. Modest perhaps, but it is help. The children of Ukraine need that. News tells us that for the third straight night or fourth straight night, many of them have been sleeping underground in railroad stations because they were so afraid of bombs and armament being fired at their direction. But, Karen, even if we say it's lopsided kasi masyadong malaki yung Russia at mukhang maliit masyadong Ukraine, to the tribute of the Ukrainians, they have put up a very strong resistance. And the scoreboard has not at all been against Ukraine all the time.
Yeah, in terms of fatalities.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah. But do you see that?
You know, and what I admire so much, Mike and Karen, is this, no? When the hostilities were starting, the U.S. was offering Zelensky a refuge so that he could head a government in exile. But like a true president, he stayed on the ground and donned military fatigues in order to fight. You know, people made fun of him because he was a comedian.
Yeah, an actor
president.
Played,
Yeah, he played president, and now he's actually the president. But he's showing us his real worth. He's showing us his real worth, and I believe what Professor Claire Carlos says. No, don't underrate comedians. They have a very perspicacious understanding of things.
So on that, I was gonna say
to be a comedian.
I know, but I remember. I think Attorney Mike, you brought up Dolphy before in terms of being asked if he wanted to run for president. But I was going to joke. See, we should have had Dolphy run for president.
Tignan nyo yung John and Marcia. Panay, it seemed to be all a comedy and a joke, but in and through the jokes, there was plenty of insight into human nature there.
That's
And
very
especially the Filipino way of life. That's true.
Yeah, and a lot of
But-
negotiations, I suppose, domestically, right?
Yeah, Father Randy, I'm glad you mentioned also the General Assembly Security Council, which was also mentioned by Attorney Karen, no? Kasi, di ba, meron tayong UN Charter at we are definitely one of the signatories. At sa UN Charter, nakikita naman natin dyan that it's required that all states respect the sovereignty of other states. And yung tinatawag natin that you do not, unlike in the past, before the UN, the use of force was accepted. If you want to occupy another country, you just use force. No, we have seen that through all the wars that we've seen in the past. But now, dahil sa charter nga, you have to refrain. So I guess the stand of the Philippines was based on that particular provisions of the UN Charter. Eh, ang tanong ko, Father Rani, yung bang the Security Council, from what I understand, of course, it was the other countries abstained. China, of course, Russia, India, I believe, and United Arab Emirates. But what I was trying to understand is they could have come up with a stronger wording. Because ang intindi ko, instead of condemn, they changed it to the word deplore. Instead of invoking Section 7, or rather Chapter 7, of the right to use force as a self-defense. Kasi nakalagay naman sa UN Charter that actually, you can actually use force, but it's when you're trying to defend yourself or to defend the Charter itself. Pero pati yung pagbigay ng declaration dun mismo sa Security Council resolution na pwede niyong gamitan ng force, pinatanggal nila. Ito pa ano ba to? Horse trading na to? Of course, I've never worked in the UN. Baka naman mayroong mga dynamics doon na hindi natin alam among the members of the Security Council, etc. Pero what do you think about that, Father Rani? In a way that make the United Nations just a bunch of people just talking and talking, but at the end of the day, they cannot actually do anything?
Yeah, that's the perception of many people, no? But let's not forget that in that very powerful Security Council, you have the 5 permanent members who have veto powers.
Yes.
And that is exactly why the matter was taken away from the Security Council and is being dealt with now by the General Assembly, because had they persisted in making the Security Council pass the resolution, ay tsak na magvi-veto ang Russia, and that would have been the end of the story. But at least sa General Assembly, walang veto power. And so they may be able to proceed with a resolution which, though it does not have the force of a Security Council resolution, will still be a clear statement of where the rights lie. In regard to the mobilization of force by the UN, only the Security Council can direct that.
Yes.
But I'd also like to say this, no? The General Assembly can articulate with definitiveness the duties and obligations of states under the UN Charter. So, pwede niyang sabihin, itong nangyayari ngayon ay maliwanag na paglabag sa Charter ng United Nations, at nananawagan kami sa lahat ng bansa na gawin ang whatever it is that in the end they may resolve to do. And even if it is only a resolution that deplores, regrets what Russia is doing, that to me, Mike, would already go a long way in telling the world sila ay mali. Hindi pwedeng panigan sila ay mali.
Partner, siguro we'll take a short break, and then when we come back, let's continue talking to Dean Rani Aquino. Of course, pagsamantalahan na natin ang presence niya. So, with your indulgence, Dean, and my partner Karen, we'll take a short break. Huwag po kayong umalis. Don't touch that clicker. We'll be right back. Stay with us.
Filipino heroism, ingenuity, marksmanship, tatak sa ludo kami. Isang pagkilala sa galing ng mamamayang Pilipino, hatid ay serbisyo saan man sa mundo. Natatanging kwento ng mga overseas Filipino workers, OFW advocates, legal luminaries, educators, scientists, and inventors. Mga piling Pilipinong patuloy na nag-aangat sa pagtingin at pagkilala ng sambayanan. Tatak, saludo kami! Pinangungunahan ni Johnny Gomez. Tatak, saludo kami! Tuwing araw ng Sabado mula alas 2 hanggang alas 3 ng hapon. Mapapanood at mapapakinggan sa DZRJ 8:10 AM sa Radio Bandido TV, Sky Cable Channel 224, TV Plus boxes at free-to-air. Simulcast live sa www.facebook.com/DZRJ 8:10 AM at sa YouTube RJAM News.
Be enlightened with inspiring stories. Interesting biblical features. And insightful interviews with the pillars of our Catholic faith. Power to Unite with Elvira.
Welcome back. Kayo po ay nandito sa ating programa Kontra Birada. Dito po sa Radyo Bandido, saka napapanood din tayo sa RGTV. And kasama po natin ang ating partners na Atty. Jimeno, and of course ang ating special guest today, panauhin po natin ay wala iba kundi si Aquino, Father Aquino. Thank you again so much for joining us. Siguro napag-usapan na natin ng UN, no? Nag-raise din si Atty. Karen ng mga yun nga yung importansya ng mga Security Council resolutions. But siguro sa ngayon, why don't we also try to go closer dito sa atin, no, sa Pilipinas? I guess gusto malaman ng ating mga kababayan exactly ano ang epekto ng giyera na kalayo-layo naman. Nandun naman sa Europe yan, malayo yan. Kumbaga malayo sa bituka, no, so to speak. But maybe perhaps it is best that for our people to know na meron ba or wala bang epekto ang pangyayari na nagaganap ngayon sa Ukraine?
Yes.
Din?
You know, Atty. Mike, when we were having this Sanbeda Forum, Consul General Henry Bensurto was with us, no? At
Yes.
isa sa napaka mahalagang sinabi niya ay, war creates a mindset. And then he gave this illustration. Nung sinakop ng China ang mga iba't ibang features ng West Philippine Sea, over which the Philippines enjoys sovereign rights, at walang kibo ang US, pinabayaan lang tayo sa kamay ng China, China was emboldened. See? So, China said, okay naman pala walang aangal nito. So, if that is the case, we have to be careful because kung anong argumentong ginamit ni Putin sa Ukraine, pwede ring gamitin ng PROC sa Taiwan. At yan ay malapit na sa atin. At pwede niya ring gamitin sa mga inaangkin niyang mga isla, mga pulo, mga parte ng dagat dyan sa West Philippine Sea. That's why napakahalaga na ang pagtutol natin sa illegal na aksyon na ito ay walang humpay, no? Consistent objection, persistent objection to an illegality and participation in any and all forms of communal action in order to sanction Russia and make Russia realize that the world does not agree with it.
Yeah, I think that's, for me, that's very enlightening because I didn't see it also in terms of, I just saw it as having effects on inflation, on the price of commodities because of the oil. But that's a very good insight, Dean Aquino, in terms of how it will affect politically the Philippines, especially since we have these existing claims that have been litigated at the arbitral tribunal, but hasn't been really respected up to now. And I was going to ask about that. So we talked about the General Assembly earlier, but another superpower internationally is China. And I was going to ask, how does China fit in all of this? Are they going to be interested, now that you mentioned also how they are kind of doing their own assertion against other territories? Where do you think China will place themselves in this conflict?
Oh, there is no doubt. Xi Jinping is very friendly towards Putin now, despite historical tensions in the past. They are very close to each other now. And I also have no doubt that Xi Jinping is watching out for the end game, because if it works for Russia vis-a-vis Ukraine, it should work for China vis-a-vis Taiwan or vis-a-vis Hong Kong or portions of the West Philippine Sea. Kaya I have always insisted that the moment you sit down with the devil to dinner, you might think that it's a very friendly dinner, but the devil has a very long spoon and he will reach into your bowl, and soon you will find that you have nothing left in your bowl, you see.
Well, I think that's happening to us in terms of the waters where they're also fishing in our waters, and I find that analogy very appropriate, Father Rani.
Why did we lose Scarborough Shoal? In the arbitral judgment, napakaliwanag. The Scarborough Shoal is common fishing ground. In other words, it was illegal for China to drive away our fishermen. But eventually, why are we not sending our fishermen there anymore? Why can't our fishermen go there? Again, acquiescence. Eventually, the whole world and the powers that would have been able to stop China just acquiesced to the situation, and so China had its way. The thing is never to give in, I think, never to give in. And I really admire the Ukrainians for standing up to Putin like this.
Parang ano yan, Father, no? Dean, partner, natandaan niyo po, di ba, noong panahon ng World War II, di ba, I understand, if you recall, Prime Minister Chamberlain, di ba, he even went to see, I think, Adolf Hitler, Mussolini, and he was saying that there will be now peace in our times. But actually, there were those saying, do not, because you're sitting down with the devil, as you mentioned. And we all know what happened. In 1939, Blitzkrieg was introduced for the first time, and we saw the German tanks roll into Poland, Czechoslovakia, etc., etc. So, tama po yung puntong rinaise nyo, Dean. No? I think we all agree with that, and I think yung ating nakikinig, naniniwala din dyan na pag may masyadong yung tinatawag mong acquiescence, no? O pagpababaya, o you're not defending your rights, at nakita ng mga kalaban na talagang, hindi naman pala tayo pinapansin, okay lang pala eh. So nakakaroon ng creeping, no? Creeping invasion, if you may call it, no? Slowly, little by little, and sa China nga daw, it's called the cabbage strategy. They peel it slowly, one by one, pinipil nila hanggat makuha ka na. Kaya maganda po na rinaise nyo po yan para marinig ng ating mga policymakers at sa gobyerno at ating mga kababayan na we really have to take a stand when it comes to our national territory, our national sovereignty.
You know, Mike, in fact, talking about acquiescence, no? When the first days of the invasion took place, many were saying, this isn't really an invasion. Why? Because Putin is sending his people to the Donbas area. Mm-hmm. But they have been there for a long time already. In fact, he recognized the independence of these separatist areas that claimed to be separate states. So it seemed that he would confine himself to the Donbas only, to the Donetsk basin, but he did not. He went on, and one more myth that has been shattered by this Ukrainian crisis is this: noon, what was the justification kung bakit nag-iimbak ng nuclear weapons ang mga superpowers? Ang dahilan nila ganito, it is when both sides are armed to the teeth that you can be sure that they will not fight each other. But when you have a man like Putin who doesn't seem to count the costs, he will go to war, notwithstanding the fact that it may prove very costly for his people. Alam mo, Mike and Karen, ilang beses ko nang sinabi ito, war is many times not a matter of geopolitics or it is of course all that, but many times it boils down to the idiosyncrasies, to the temper and to the tantrums of individuals.
Very well said. Like same with North Korea, I think.
Yeah.
Very well said, Dean Aquino. But I think going back to the issue of countries standing up to this type of aggression, which is clearly illegitimate. For all the presidential candidates here with 2022 elections, it's always been asked, what are you going to do with respect to protecting the Philippines against China's claims on the West Philippine Sea? And if we go by this logic of standing up to an international aggression, like an extraterritorial aggression coming from a superpower like Russia or China, the practical answer is always, or at least what I've heard as well from our presidential candidates, would be to balance that with diplomacy, because I feel that there's always this fear that we're not strong enough to repel any aggression. So, Dean Aquino, how would you also make sense of an appropriate response where we are asserting ourselves, but also being practical in terms of our ability, like even our army, like or we don't even really have an air force. We don't have the fighter planes for that. So how do we make that stand against aggression?
Yeah, first of all, Karen, let me refer to the presidential candidates now. One good service that the presidential candidates can do for the whole nation is to inform themselves better. Because I've heard some of their comments, and there's plenty of abysmal ignorance in the statements they make. No, so usually they will give you platitudes like, well, a mixture of firmness and all that. Yeah, I think when we ask, how then should we deal with Chinese incursions into the West Philippine Sea? In the first place, for heaven's sake, let's not abandon those islands and features that we already control. Abandoning them is the first step towards inviting the enemy in. Let's not abandon them. And the second is to strengthen, to regionalize the issue. The Philippines alone is weak, yes, but the Philippines is a member of ASEAN, and in 2015 we integrated ASEAN. And one of the reasons for ASEAN integration was regional security. And regional security centers on the West Philippine Sea. So I think that the issue should be regionalized. And the last point I'd like to make, Karen, is something that Chancellor Scholz told the German Bundestag. He said, for the past years, we have hardly given a penny to our army, with the result that we have an army that is hardly capable of defending our interests in our territory. So immediately he announced a package of budgetary allocations for the army in the next budget. And I think we should learn a lesson from that too. Of course, we don't have that much to spare, but Alam mo, sa dami ba naman ng foreign aid na natanggap natin, kung ito'y sana hindi nalustay at hindi nagamit na kung saan-saan, we would have a more respectable army rather than that dilapidated ship that is parked in the West Philippine Sea na nakakatawa at nakakaawa talaga ang itsura ng bapor na yan, no? If that is the ship that we put there to defend our rights, no wonder China is laughing at us.
Yeah, just the ability to even patrol, like, the constant conflict that we have in our the fishing areas. We are clearly unable to assert ourselves against China.
Alam mo, I tell my students in public international law, no, there is this doctrine in international law on the extent of the territorial sea and the contiguous zone and the exclusive economic zone, and that we have a right of hot pursuit when any of our rights is... But how can we pursue kung ang kalaban natin ay speedboat ang gamit na, tayo bangka naman ang gamit natin? Paano tayo mag-hot pursuit yan? Hindi talaga obra.
I agree. I've seen some of our like Navy posts in this in the Sulu-Sulawesi triangle, because I've gone to Tubataha Reef before, and they actually have to, so there's usually just 4 of them in the station, but they have to ration the fresh water, so they have to take turns taking a bath. I mean, that's the situation. So, I'm just thinking, kung fresh water nga hindi ma-provide, paano pa yung mga ammunition and other things, right? How can you have a strong military defending us when the basic requirement of fresh water is not even available to them? So, you raise a very good point, Father Rani, and I really hope that whoever becomes the next president will make sense of what to do, but also really rationalize that plan by having the right funding and then the right equipment and training that we need to be able to protect ourselves. Like, I feel like this is has been an ongoing issue that we have not really addressed as a nation. Well, I'm going to go back to... Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. Father Rani, I understand, and Attorney Karen and I would like your take on this, Dean. No, I understand that that Ukraine has taken Russia to the International Court of Justice, and we all know the ICJ is part of the UN Charter, and then it's supposed to settle disputes among sovereign states. What will be your assessment of the strength of such a case, and if, assuming for the sake of argument that Ukraine easily wins this case, what will be the grounds that the ICJ will decide in favor of Ukraine?
Well, I can predict the first move. The first move of Russia will be to reject the jurisdiction of the ICJ. That's the usual maneuver that happened. Yeah, China. And not only that, the US is itself a very good example of a superpower that rejects jurisdiction when it's not suitable to it. Remember the case of Nicaragua versus US?
Yes.
The US refused to appear.
I was going to say that there.
The US refused to appear before
Yes.
the United Nations, but fortunately, the International Court of Justice usually asserts its jurisdiction even when its jurisdiction is rejected by one of the state parties. And I'm sure that the ground for proceeding against Russia will be aggression. The only problem with aggression is, you see, the International Criminal Court that is established by the Statute of Rome is supposed to try 4 crimes: genocide, crimes against humanity, violation of the laws and customs of war, and aggression. But in actual fact, they will tell you that only 3 crimes are being tried there because there is no consensus yet on what constitutes aggression. However, in this case, I think that there is a clear violation of the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine, and that will give Ukraine firm grounding to proceed against Russia.
And how long does the ICJ normally take when they try a case?
Well, like all cases, Karen, wherever you have lawyers, you have dilatory, moves, you have dilatory tactics, and even in international law, sometimes procedural issues alone take months. So there is a judgment first on procedural issues, then a judgment on the merits. Kaya matagal din, pero ang importante dyan, at the end of the process, masasabi ng isang kuhukuman na international in character, ikaw ang nagkasala dito, magbayad ka ng danyos. Magbayad ka ng danyos.
That was what I was looking for, Father Rani, in terms of people listening to us right now, because at the end of the day, like, for ordinary citizens, the question would be, so what's the point? What's the point of going to ICJ if it's gonna take months?
No, pwedeng magbayad ng danyos. Oh.
And does that go to, it goes just to the government, but are there case precedents that show whether civilians who are affected eventually benefit from the payment of damages?
Well, that will be up to the government because, Karen, in the ICJ, the only one that enjoys locus standi is the state, never the individual. So if the state wins and is awarded damages, then it will be for the state to see to it that the individuals most affected get benefited from it. However, if they have a corrupt leadership, which does not seem to be the case, then the damages will never reach the damaged persons, no?
Yeah. Because right now in Ukraine, I saw that in Kiev, for instance, like a lot of the people have already been, they have left. But there are people who obviously they're forced to leave. So a lot of damage in terms of employment, but also families being separated. But even for OFWs, the Filipinos, they've been forced to leave their jobs, and for a lot of them, they don't even want to leave Ukraine because their prospects there are, according to them, better than having to come back here. But just the extent of damage is widespread. So I guess.
And talking about the people who had to leave home, Karen, in Ukraine, I think it is also appropriate that we give thanks to Poland that has been very hospitable to these refugees. Remember that when there was a similar refugee crisis, some states closed their borders. You remember when refugees were fleeing from the war-torn areas? So many states closed their borders. For some time, Germany was very hospitable, but when Angela Merkel felt the heat that was caused by so many displaced Germans because of the influx of migrants and refugees, she tightened the border gates. Well, Poland has been very hospitable, and the neighboring countries as well, Romania, and I think we should thank them for that too, and express appreciation for their humanitarian gesture.
Yeah.
We join you in thanking them, Dean Aquino. We totally agree, and we also pray, of course, for the people of Ukraine and Russia. We'll take a short break. Dean, I hope, please still join us for a bit.
I kind of broke Dean Aquino in by saying this is 5 to 6 p.m. But while we still have him hostage, we hope that he can stay.
Okay, no problem.
Huwag muna kayong umalis sa ating nakikinig at nanonood. Don't go away. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
PBA Party List for Youth and Sports. Tuloy ang pagtulong sa inyo. Legal, financial, medical assistance. Magbibigay ng scholarship. Focusing on youth and sports. Yeah. PBA PBA Party List.
Radio Bandido, recognized and awarded as protector of your democracy in EDSA 1 and EDSA 2. In 2022, our democracy will be put to the test once again. So Radio Bandido will strike again. Our democratic army is in place to give you unbiased, real news and facts so you yourself can decide. Legendary and game-changing commentators. Our lineup, starting with the legendary Ray Langit, joined by the most influential bloggers in the country, Banat Bay and the Pugad bloggers, and other dynamic commentators, Tita Carmen, Jimmy Morato, Barbie Atienza, Bernard Tan, Johnny Gomez, Pete Morato, Sal Panelo with Sal's Panel O, and more announcers and reporters fighting for democracy. Teleradio Bandido is heard on DZRJ 8:10 a.m., seen on Sky Cable Channel 224, TV Plus boxes, and streaming live on Facebook/DZRJ 8:10 a.m. and YouTube channel RJAM News.
Everyone, and we're back.
Welcome back. Nandito po tayo sa ating palatuntunan Kontra Birada. At kasama po natin si Atty. Karen Jimeno, ako po si Atty. Mike Toledo. Ang ating panauhin today is none other than Dean Rani Aquino. Again, maraming salamat Dean Rani. Alam po sinabi ni Atty. Karen, 5 to 6 ka lang. Ngunit talagang maganda po ang usapan natin at maganda po ang mga feedback na ating mga tagapakinig at nanonood. Kaya with your kind indulgence, sir, spend a few more minutes with us. Dean, alam naman natin, siguro as an aside, pero importanteng bagay, Ukraine is one of the biggest producers of wheat. Kaya nga sinasabi nila kung magkaroon ng problema sa Ukraine, baka pa yung presyo po ng pasta sa pandesal ay tataas.
But even then, the other commodities that are supposed to increase in price will be everything for the Philippines when oil was going up.
Correct.
So they said that when the price of oil goes up about 40%, there's about a 40% increase in the price of commodities, basically.
You know, Mike, we recently have had a problem with wheat already. Kaya nga these pandesal makers have resorted to making the size of the pandesal smaller. Because wheat has become more expensive. Now, with this again, who can tell how far the detriment will be to us? Although it does not seem like we have any direct economic connections, let's not forget that traffic through the Baltic Sea and all of this will be affected by this ongoing conflict. That's why I really hope that principled negotiations take place. Kaya nga, I admire naman the verb of Zelensky who will not just kowtow to Moscow, no?
Sabi nga ni Zelensky, di ba? When the Russians come, you will see our faces, not our backs.
That's
Talaga
correct.
namang strong words, no?
Yes.
But Dean Rani, if you don't mind, no, and maybe we just want to pick on your brains kasi maraming nagsasabi na talagang how should the United States now, as the still recognized global world power and the leader, no, and of course the beacon of democracy globally, in the short term, how should they approach this problem? And in the long term, how should they position themselves? How should they act? Because depending on what they do, this could actually really show to one and all, to all and sundry, exactly how the United States stands on certain fundamental issues. Ano pong pananaw niya? Ano
Good point,
ano
Mike.
dapat?
Good point, Mike. When you speak of how the United States stands on fundamental issues, because this is a very fundamental issue. The United States has always bandied itself as the champion of democracy, and now the very essence of democracy, which consists in the right of a people to self-determination, is threatened by Putin. You see, I have no doubt that if we were under a Bush presidency, the United States would have gone to war or would have taken a more active stance. Bush was not going to be pushed around. But you have a clueless Biden who is so, I don't know, I can hardly describe this man. But, you know, Mike and Karen, in fairness to the President of the United States, he is also dealing with a restive population that does not want to send its husbands and sons anymore to war. They are war fatigued. That's one reason that they are not taking a more active role. But that should not stop them, for example, from aiding Ukraine with all the military hardware that they can probably get into Ukraine. You know, up to last night, one problem was, how would Germany send its hardware to Ukraine? Because any country through which it would pass would be implicating itself in the war. And this morning, I got my answer. They were going to pass through Poland. And yes, Poland, well, it's of course a country in a position to do that. And I would like to see the United States standing up for Ukraine more visibly, more resolutely. Rhetoric is not enough. The time for rhetoric has ended. There are people dying in the battlefield now. They need ammunitions, they need anti-tank weapons. And if it is true that the Russians have amassed thermal weapons to bring into Ukraine for an assault on Kiev, then at least they should have the means to protect themselves from these deadly weapons.
That's those are very good points, Father Rani. And I do remember President Zelensky also saying before that when President Biden announced the measures they were taking against Russia, he said, well, these are good, these are not enough. And do you think that tomorrow, I think President Biden is scheduled to, well, tomorrow Philippine time, but I guess that's evening in the US. He's supposed to give an announcement with respect to perhaps new measures that will be taken by the US. But, you know, he's supposed to give an announcement, President Biden, on the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Do you think that with the current deficit of the US post-pandemic, you know, with all the issues and then the low approval rating of Biden, do you think his decision would be towards being more present and visible in upholding democracy in Ukraine?
Sadly, no. I don't see that happening, because Biden is facing a population that is, well, ambiguous towards him, ambivalent towards him, but definitely also does not like to sacrifice its men and boys to the war. You know, Mike and Karen, I have been expecting in the past few days for a significant statement from Blinken. He has been mysteriously silent. Maybe here and there he has issued some remark, but nothing that really changes the equation, nothing that really makes a dent on anything that is happening now. And this is the hour that Blinken should be most audible to the whole world. And if Putin knows exactly what Blinken wants to bring across, to get across, and that is that he will not stand for bullying That will be something.
So,
Interesting.
Father Ran, just to follow up on that partner, no, kasi we were talking about the United States seems to be not really acting the way they should, being the beacons of democracy. Just to follow up on that, shouldn't we now, as Filipinos, worry? Kasi kung ganito ang nangyayari, di ba? Kung ganito ang nangyayari dyan, we have a mutual defense treaty with the United States. But I recall in the past, even President Obama, if I'm not mistaken, when he was asked point blank in Japan whether the United States will go into war if Japanese, especially Senkaku Islands, for example, is attacked by any foreign power for that matter, China for that matter, and he was very categorical. But I recall when he visited the Philippines, and that was then President Obama, and asked the same question, and he was in front of President Aquino, his answer was ambivalent. It was only during the time of President Trump that they were very quite clear, including his Secretary of State and his Vice President Pence. They were very clear that the Mutual Defense Treaty will be triggered if any of our ships, for example, or territories being invaded. Would you think now, God forbid, kung merong incursion by the Chinese, do you think, in your opinion, now, what is your level of confidence that the United States will be there and will really take a more aggressive stance?
It will look for every clause possible to excuse itself from involvement. That is why, Karen and Atty. Mike, no, I am most in favor of renegotiating the Mutual Defense Treaty and making its provisions clearer in behalf of the Republic of the Philippines, such that any attack or any attempt or any incursion into any part of our territory, even maritime zones, should be enough to trigger a response from the United States. So I'm all in favor of renegotiating the Mutual Defense Treaty. After all, it's not we alone who stand to benefit from the Mutual Defense Treaty. The Mutual Defense Treaty is a treaty that seeks to keep in place the balance of power. And after the Treaty of Westphalia, the order of the world has been balance of power. And the Mutual Defense Treaty is a measure in that direction. So the U.S. should not say that that treaty is only to our advantage. No, it is to their advantage as well, because it keeps the crucial balance of power that they are so intent at keeping.
Yeah. But I was thinking about the same thing, Attorney Mike, and also worried that, if we are to have conflict with China, it seems like this whole a crisis with Ukraine is kind of like an example of how much they would get involved in order to preserve peace or democracy in other countries. And I guess and now that we're talking about that, I just remember some analyst that I read was saying that, but this was early on when the conflict started, that he sees this as more of a field wherein it's really going to be a conflict between two superpowers, US and Russia. But it appears that it's not really going to play out that way. Do you see, Father Rani, any country that could play a crucial or pivotal role in order to help Ukraine at least have some leverage against Russia?
Since sometime in the past, it has always been we allied with the US in order to check the power of Russia, in order to see to it that China does not harm us. But I'm in favor of multilateralizing the defense of the Philippines. In other words, instead of staking all our odds with the United States, instead of putting all our eggs in the US basket, which has turned out not to be a very safe basket after all, why don't we shore up our relations with others who could possibly come to our aid and who could possibly help us in a network of defense that will not implicate only one superpower, but will involve a network. And that is why, Karen, I've never given up on the idea really of strengthening ASEAN.
Is that similar to Quad, Father?
Again,
Quad?
yes, the Quad. Well, remember,
Similar to
Karen,
Quad?
remember the Quad? This was the first question in the SM&I debate, no?
Yeah, of Professor Carlos, yeah.
And from the answers given, it was evident to me that many were not aware what the Quad was. Yes, well, of course, I would be in favor. ASEAN should stay as it is in terms of its economic thrusts, in terms of its cultural thrusts, but it should also evolve into some kind of a defense alliance. In fact, they said that in 2015, when we inked a series of treaties for ASEAN integration, they said one of the reasons for integration is regional security. So let's make that come to pass, and let's see to it that even if ASEAN will not exactly be a Quad, because these are heavyweights, nevertheless we can afford to put up a network of protection similar to that which Quad makes possible.
Yeah, well,
The
I
thing
hope
is-
that some presidential candidates are listening right now so they can be educated on what
Yeah.
a Quad is.
Attorney Karen, the thing is, the problem with ASEAN, we have seen it. We have seen it with our own eyes. But I totally agree with Father Rani, with Dean Aquino, that it should even be beyond just economic trade arrangements between countries. And it should be a security arrangement as well. Pero nakita naman po natin, especially when it concerns the matter of Chinese aggression. I recall in several ASEAN meetings, even APEC, if I'm not mistaken, or specifically ASEAN, we try to really, I think the Philippines, they do their best. No? Our Foreign Affairs Secretary, as well as the President himself, will really try to do their best to get a strong statement from our fellow ASEAN members. But the truth of the matter is, and the sad part is, we hardly get them to agree to what we want written down. Parang sa kanila, they don't want to
You don't want to be
wake up
part of
the
it.
giant, di ba? Ayaw nila yung makaaway ang China. And of course, we have countries, if I may, countries like, of course, Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, that will really be pro-China, whatever happens. So, how difficult would that be? While I totally agree with you,
Yeah. In terms of
Aquino,
realistic,
but how difficult will that be?
Yeah, you are
Yes.
talking about realpolitik, no? And that's correct. You have identified the countries that will be intransigently pro-China. But in the end, when ASEAN nations realize that they have only each other to rely on, and this conflict in Ukraine is a very good example of why one should not trust one or two allies alone, then I think everybody will be willing to rethink his position. And perhaps the friendship of some ASEAN states with China can be put to good use. We can make use of them in order to enter into some kind of rapprochement with China that is nevertheless principled and that is in accordance with international law.
well, I would vote you as President or Secretary of Foreign Affairs.
You have my vote as well.
solutions, yeah. Before I mean, just listening to you, Dean Aquino, I just feel like there's a lot of more solutions that are attainable. Before I just thought of it as like super muddled in my head, and I just kind of think that as small players, it would be impossible for us to reach really any solution in terms of our national security against China. But also I just keep looking at this whole issue with Ukraine and Russia as an example of what can happen with the Philippines and China in terms of the dynamic as well. Well, we have 10 minutes left, so I guess I want to ask what for the Filipinos, what can we expect if this progresses and gets worse? Like Zelensky doesn't negotiate with Putin, and then Putin just decides to be more aggressive in their military attacks on Ukraine. How do you think this will eventually affect the Philippines and other countries?
Well, eventually the economic fallout will hit us as well. You cannot avoid that. The world today is such that you can no longer keep in one corner an upheaval, considering the interrelatedness of almost all parts of the world. A pain in one part of the world will certainly hit us all and hit the most vulnerable, and we are a very vulnerable country. At the same time, it should goad us in the Philippines to take a long and hard look at our defense strategy, our defense policies, and our foreign policy. It is very important for us to be very clear about our foreign policy. Kaya nga, I have been very strong on this. Kaysa indulging our presidential candidates on pettiness, really pettiness, that is so annoying at times, why don't we ask them what are their foreign policies? What are their positions vis-a-vis foreign issues? What is their blueprint for a defense strategy for the Philippines? All of these have been brought to our attention because of the ongoing crisis in the Ukraine. And let's not think that it happens so far away that it has nothing to do with us. We live in an interdependent, interrelated world, and it certainly will affect us.
Yeah, and not just in terms of economically prices of commodities. You mean also our national security?
Yes, and also our own concept of what it is to be secure and safe, and what alliances should look like. This crisis should take us into a rethinking of all of this.
Yeah. Well, if anything, I think that there might be, it would cast doubt as well. Well, depending on what President Biden will say later, West, and tomorrow, our time, it might cast doubt as well on the the strength of the U.S. as an ally, and then any benefit from that. There might be more of a pivot away from the U.S. And do you think that this would also affect the integrity of international agreements and international bodies like the ICJ?
I hope that pivoting away from the U.S. will not mean pivoting towards China, as seemed to be happening in the past few years. But in regard to international institutions, Mike and Karen, I've always said this. This crisis has really tested international law. And while many people are cynical about international law, the reality of international law is what allows us to say Putin is wrong and he has no business being in Ukraine. If there were no international law, or if international law were weakened further, then this spate of condemnation would be nothing more than hot air and empty rhetoric. But precisely because there's international law, we can say Putin has to leave Ukraine. He has no business being there. And he has no business dictating on the Ukrainian people who their allies are and who their allies should be. That's always my quarrel with those who would reduce the whole debate to a geopolitical strategic discussion. You have to include the normative element of law, because without law, it's simply the rule of whoever is strongest. And I wish to thank you, Mike and Karen, for listening to me and being patient with my views. No?
No, no, I
Fantastic.
appreciate it. I think
Fantastic.
for me,
Yeah.
you were able to summarize one. We started off with the origin of this conflict, but summarize a lot of the issues out there without me having to go through so many sources and so many articles. And I guess like the frustrating part is a lot of the when this whole conflict came up, a lot of the articles are just more of reporting what is happening, at that very superficial level where on this date Russia sent troops outside of the borders of Donbass and blah blah blah. Like you don't really understand anything, which is really, I have to admit, the same with me. I'm busy enough with my work that I don't understand fully what is going on, and I just started to worry when the prices of oil kept going up, and thought to myself, is this gonna keep going up, without really comprehending more like what this all means for us, not just now but in our future.
Yeah. Father Rani, talagang you were able to really explain to all of us ating nakikinig at nanonood and explain exactly what's happening and what are the economic and legal implications. And your last statement, in my view, sa aming pananaw, ay talagang na-summarize yung talaga ang sitwasyon ngayon. Siguro as a partner, as a parting question to to Father Rani, in relation to what you just said, ang sinasabi kasi ng mga ibang mga authors, international lawyers, is that the international law per se is soft law. Soft law daw. Hindi hard law. Meaning to say, hard law, like in the Philippines, klaro-klaro yung batas, may nagkamali, magkakaroon ng trial, found guilty, sentence. Hard law. Pero sa United Nations daw, soft law. May law, may charter, pero hindi talaga na-enforce. Kayo ba po ay naniniwala na ganun pa rin ang status ng international law? O nag-evolve na po?
No, I don't. If international law were soft law, then territorial boundaries would be could easily be transgressed. Ambassadors could be arrested. The high seas would no longer be secure. But all of these things are guaranteed by international law. Of course, there are areas of international law that are correctly classified as quote-unquote soft law, but there is a body of international law, both conventional law and customary law, that is established and beyond question. And one